Greetings and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Islamophobia, a podcast project brought to you from the The.Bridge.Initiative here at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My name is Arsalan Iftikhar. I am an international human rights lawyer, a senior fellow at the The.Bridge.Initiative, and author of the book Fear of a Muslim Planet, Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. My guests today are Sahar, Aziz, and Mitchell Plitnick, who are co-authors of a November 2023 Rutgers University report from the Center for Security, Race and Rights entitled, quote, Presumptively Antisemitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which examines how anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia have been used to silence criticism of the Israeli government during the current Gaza war. Sahar Aziz is the Distinguished Professor of Law and Middle East Legal Studies at Rutgers University and author of the book The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. We are also joined by Mitchell Plitnick, President of Rethinking Foreign Policy and co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. He is also the author of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, which he co-authored with our mutual friend, Professor Mark Lamont Hill. Sahar and Mitchell, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yep. Glad to be here.
So, question number one, Sahar. I'd like to start with you. The November 2023 report and its executive summary notes that the calendar year 2023 has become the deadliest year on record ever for Palestinians, with leading genocide scholars, international legal experts, and global human rights organizations warning that the world is, quote, witnessing a genocide, unchecked war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity by the current right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Can you tell us a little bit about why you and Mitchell decided to write this report about Islamophobia coverage during the Gaza war?
First, thanks so much for having us. So the report was not originally intended to address what I believe is what the International Court of Justice has concluded is a plausible case for genocide, and it wasn't addressed to deal with the multiple sieges on Gaza and military assaults on Gaza that Israel has been engaging in for over 15 years. The report's intention, which we started writing over a year ago, was to ensure that Muslims, whether they were Arab, whether they were South Asians, whether they were of any ethnic or racial background, that Muslims could engage on the Palestine-Israel issue, conflict, siege, and now I think, again, it's the right framing is genocide, without being accused of being anti-Semitic, without being marginalized, without being silenced, and without being denied the fundamental American right to engage in free speech and to engage in academic freedom if you are a professor like myself, or to be politically active on this issue. Because what we kept seeing time and time again, and it's nothing new, but it was long past due to actually write about it and do the research, is that Muslims were being silenced. They were being excluded from a very important conversation in the American political system because the U.S. provides nearly $4 billion a year in military aid to Israel. That military aid funds the military attacks against Gazans or Palestinians in Gaza, as well as various military assaults in the West Bank. So we are not detached actors, right? The United States is not like another country that provides no money to Israel's military. Quite the contrary, we are aiding and abetting. We're contributing directly to whatever the Israeli military does, whether it's against its own people or against Palestinians. And if that action and that military action violates human rights, then we absolutely should be, all of us should be engaged in that conversation, including determining whether we're violating U.S. law, right, by funding nations or militaries that violate, like the Leahy, right, amendment that the international lawyers in the audience are familiar with. And I'll say that I've been involved in similar issues regarding Egypt, right? Because the US provides Egypt a very large military aid package. And I've been personally involved in advocating to stop that kind of funding if it funds human rights. So the report wants to stop this exceptionalization of criticism of Israel. right? And the first step in doing that is ensuring that Muslim Americans are able to be equal citizens, equal participants in their conversations to bring their critical perspectives, including Palestinian perspectives, because a vast majority of Palestinians are Muslim, but a sizable number also Christian. But ultimately, we want to be equal citizens in this debate. We want to be part of this conversation.
Mitchell, during a recent interview on Al Jazeera English, you discussed the concept of a quote radicalized double standard, which is quote unquote most acute for Muslim or Arab Americans when they exercise their free speech rights to criticize the U.S. government's failure to hold Israel and its government accountable for its actions. Could you elaborate for us on what you mean when you say a quote radicalized double standard for Muslims and Arabs within modern political discourse today?
Well, I think we saw a stunning example of it early on relatively early on in the Gaza so-called war, when Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American member of Congress, was censured, which is for basically for using the term "from the river to the sea," which is a contentious statement that's sort of artificially manufactured contention. It obviously the words themselves seem fairly innocuous. They have been used by Israelis and even before the state of Israel by Zionist leaders for a very long time. But because Hamas also once used it, it has now been translated as code for basically for statements of anti-Jewish animus. And that is clearly not the way it is intended to be used in general. In any case, Rashida used that phrase and called what Israel is doing in Gaza I believe the phrase she used was ethnic cleansing, which I think is very clearly the case. That not being a legal term as genocide is, more of a political one. I think we can look at that and say when you force most of a population in an area into one small southern piece of it, that's ethnic cleansing. People had a political objection. Look, you can have a political objection. You can have a debate. You can say she is wrong. You can say she shouldn't have said that if you want to do that. But censure in the House of Representatives is a big deal. This has happened 6 times. She was the 6th person to be censured. The 3 of them were supporters of the Confederacy. So she is one of only 3 people who were not outright supporters of secession who have ever in the history of the House been censured. That was for using this phrase in this context. What Sahar described, I think, is precisely a radical double standard. We look at the discussion of policy towards Palestine mostly through the eyes of supporters of Israel. And, while that tends to center on the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, which speaks as if it speaks for all Jews and does not by any means speak for all Jews, as we've seen by the faces of the people who have been leading the protests against what Israel is doing in Gaza, where we have seen Jews, Muslims, and allies arm in arm very prominently leading those protests. That tends to be what we are looking at. That's the filter through which we have the policy discussions around Israel and Palestine. And when people who object to those policies and say, well, we are supporting things in Israel that are essentially war crimes. And I'm talking even before all of this started on October 7th. We have excluded those voices and exclude them very harshly if they are Arab or Muslim. Part of this is racism. Part of this is simply a matter of brown-skinned people being disadvantaged. But the bigger part is what we talk about in the report is Islamophobia. I think it's crucial to recognize that when we talk about a pro-Israel discourse, we are also talking about an anti-Palestinian discourse. Those two things the 2 phrases are interchangeable, but we tend not to identify support for Israel as opposition for Palestinian rights. To some extent, people on the left have also fought that sort of identification, because some people, at least on the sort of what I might call maybe the soft left or the liberal left, have wanted to say that you can have an ethno-nationalist Jewish state that still recognizes Palestinian rights. That's been a contention. I think that has been proven not to be true. I think an ethno-nationalist state, by definition, has to discriminate against people who are not part of that ethnicity in that nation. But that, and I think that establishes that if you are talking about supporting Israel as a Jewish state, as an ethno-nationalist Jewish state, not just as a haven for Jews, which I think is fine. I think it's fine to have a country, especially after our experience in World War II. I think we need to have some set of assurances that we'll have somewhere to go, because that was the big deal in World War II. Wasn't that people, there was a government that was trying to discriminate very harshly and even kill us. The problem was we had nowhere to flee to. That was what was unique in our history. So sure, that can be addressed, but not at the expense of the rights of other people. And in Israel, we have an ethno-nationalist state that has to do that. And that's the lens through which our policy discourse has always been, really from the earliest days of Israel. That's the lens through which our policy has been viewed. And anyone who tries to view it in another way is called anti-Semitic. And that is unacceptable to me as a Jew. It should be unacceptable to anyone who's interested in legitimate political discourse.
Sahar, during the same Al Jazeera English interview, you talked about a quote zero-sum game where Muslim and Jewish people are often politically pitted against one another. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you mean by this quote zero-sum game, in your opinion?
When I wrote the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Crushes Religious Freedom, I took a very deep dive into anti-Semitism, especially in the early 20th century, and also anti-Catholic racism, because I was interested in the phenomena of the racialization of religion to perpetuate racism against a particular group, but not simply because of what they looked like, but because of their religious identity. And what I discovered was alarming to me, because it was history repeating itself, but it was a different group. And so I think what we need to understand when we look at Islamophobia today in 2024, 23 years after the 9/11 attacks, which completely transformed the public perception and the state relationship with Muslim communities in the United States in a gravely adverse manner that systematically harmed the civil rights of Muslims and those who were mistaken as Muslim. And so when you examine those last 22 years, and to some extent pre 9/11, but my book is really focused on post 9/11, and I think that's the context we should be understanding that issue through. And you look back at the early 1900s, and it's almost the same. In other words, right now, people who are critical of U.S. foreign policy, or who are critical of international relations in a way that does not toe the mainstream American line, are called Islamophobic. Well, back then, when you had, communism was the threat, or socialism was the threat, and it so happened that many Jews subscribed either to communism or socialism or Marxism or progressive politics, they were excluded from politics, they were slandered, they were defamed, they were criminalized. Now, it wasn't just Jewish Americans, but that was one of the forms of anti-Semitism, which was to use the people's political perspectives, which is completely protected against by law, as a way to racialize them, as the way to other them and exclude them. Today, if someone like myself or other Arab Muslim or Palestinian or either South Asian Muslim professors criticize Israel's policies and practices, even through an international legal frame, they are called supporters of terrorism. They're called supporters of Hamas. Right? When we were critical of the war in Iraq, when we were critical of the war in Afghanistan, we were called supporters of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS, which is completely factually false. But it's not just about the facts. It's not so much about, oh, let's debate the merits, because the merits are clearly on our side, so to speak, those of us who are experts. when we're being accused of supporting terrorist groups. Let's ask ourselves, the bigger question is, one, why can politicians and journalists and members of the elite so easily accuse us of such defamatory, right, accusations, or make such defamatory accusations, and not themselves be called out for what they are, which is Islamophobic, which is racist? And worse yet, why do they actually win elections based on that, as we saw with Trump? Why do they raise money based on that, which is what we're seeing with AIPAC, which was what we're seeing with many of these right-wing groups? And that is the fundamental problem, which is the same racism and the same roots and the same otherization that we saw in the early 20th century against Jews and Catholics, and of course, many other racial minorities. We're now seeing it in full display against Muslims. And the other similar aspect is it's completely acceptable. It's completely mainstream. At least now when we see anti-Semitism, which certainly still exists, it is rightfully condemned. The state takes it very seriously. The public takes it seriously. It condemns it. Politicians have hearings about it. Yet, when Muslims are attacked, when 3 Palestinian college students were victims of an attempted murder, right? And when one of them is now permanently paralyzed, these are the 3 in Vermont, there was no congressional hearing. There were no task forces on Islamophobia. No, they just shrugged, and nobody thought, what would we have done if they had been Jewish? If these were 3 Jewish college students and they had been attacked by someone who is anti-Semitic? It would have been a completely different response. And I think that's ultimately, and when you normalize racism, when you normalize and mainstream racism against a particular group, you are normalizing it for society. And all you do is over time, you just switch the groups out. And what I think the effort to combat anti-Semitism, anti-racism, and anti-immigrant bias, the positive impact that has had for everyone in society is it has made it politically and socially and normatively unacceptable to be racist. It may not be illegal, but it should be normatively unacceptable so that we don't create a divisive, hostile, angry, violent society. And so the zero-sum game is that we shouldn't have Muslims pitted against Jews. And that's what many right-wing Zionist groups do. And it's very unfortunate. I mean, thankfully, the silver lining in all this, and Mitchell touched on it, is the remarkable courage and activism and alliances that are being built between young Jewish American college students and young professionals with Muslim communities, and realizing that if we start to dehumanize Palestinians, which again, most Americans presume that all Palestinians are Muslim. They see this through a holy war lens, which is part of the war on terror, aftermath of the war on terror, even though this is ultimately a land dispute, right? This is about military occupation of a land that belonged to Palestinians, and now you have people who are coming from outside that country. This is why they call it, settler colonialism has become quite salient in discussing, the creation of Israel. And what to do about it now is a different issue, whether it's a one-state solution, a two-state solution. I agree with Mitchell, it should not be an ethno-nationalist state, whether it's ethno-nationalist Palestinian or whether it's ethno-nationalist Israeli Jewish. But we have to at least acknowledge what happened in 1948 and before that, for being between World War I and World War II, which is that you had Europeans who self-identified as Jewish and Zionists who came and took the land violently through militancy in 1948 by groups that, if they had done the same thing today in any other space, we would call them terrorists, because many civilians were targeted and killed as a result and ethnically cleansed. And that is ultimately the root of this problem. It is not a holy war between Muslims and Jews, right? I think anybody who researches and understands the history of Jewish experiences and of Jewish people will see clearly that in Muslim majority countries or empires, they thrived as compared to their European counterparts, right? So the anti-Semitism that we understand, the way we define it, the way we describe it in the United States, is distinctly and uniquely European, right? It is shaped around Nazism, around pogroms in what is now Russia. It is not based on Middle East politics and history, right? That is a completely different context. So what we want to do with this report, and I'm proud to call Mitchell my friend and my colleague and my co-author, is as a Jew and as a Muslim, we're working together because we understand that racism against one group opens the gateways and the floodgates to racism against other groups. So there's no reason why Jews and Muslims need to be seen as competing with each other. There's no reason why you can't stop anti-Semitism and at the same time stop Islamophobia. They are not competing with each other. It is not a zero-sum game. And the real critique that we have, or that others have, when it comes to addressing what's happening right now in Gaza, or what's happening in the borders of Israel or in the West Bank, is really a political dispute, right? It's about the politics of Zionism. So when I criticize Hamas, when I criticize a terrorist group or a militant group that self-identifies as Islamic, right? I am engaging in a political conversation. I am not condemning all Muslims, right? And similarly, I would not consider someone who criticizes Hamas or criticizes Iran or criticizes Saudi Arabia or Egypt, that I would interpret that as a Muslim as an attack on my religion or on the all Muslims, 1.8 billion Muslims. That's just such an outrageous proposition factually. But that is the type of reality that, or this myopic reality that Muslims are dealing with when all we want to do is engage in the debate. So the question is, why? Why do the Zionists want to censor us? What are they afraid of? What truth are they trying to hide? Why can't we have a debate on the merits that looks at the facts instead of campaigns of censorship on university campuses, campaigns of defamation, slander, and libel against academics and experts? And that's really the question that Americans, regardless of your religion, should be asking, is what are Zionists trying to hide? And why are they mudslinging and defaming and censoring Americans who are Muslim, right, or Arab or Palestinian, when they want to be part of that debate?
Mitchell, as a follow-up, your report also noted that there's a perpetuation of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racist tropes within the global media and Western political circles today, claiming that Muslims and Arabs are somehow inherently anti-Semitic. And so, leapfrogging off of what Sahar said, could you please elaborate a little bit on that phenomenon and the overall impact that you think that this might have on people everywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways, this is why we sort of we titled the report the way we did, is because the entire sort of structure of pro-Israel, of the pro-Israel network that operates globally, and certainly operates very powerfully here in the United States, depends on the concept of not just the idea that Muslims are anti-Semitic, but that being Muslim or being Arab brings with it a specific kind of anti-Semitism. And I think this is where we get into real mythology. Because when you actually listen, no group in the world is immune from anti-Semitism any more than any group in the world is immune from misogyny, is immune from racism, is removed from any other sort of bigotry. We find it in every group to one degree or another. So the fact that you can point to a Muslim or an Arab who is anti-Semitic is not impressive to me. There are people of all walks of life, including Jews, who are anti-Semitic. I encounter Jewish anti-Semites every day. So that is, again, nothing new. We can look at the Israeli settler movement and the sort of very anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes that they have flung against their enemies, which they identify as the Jewish left, using every single, thing, cartoon images that would have been right at home in Der Stürmer. They have had no compunction about doing that. So you find anti-Semitism everywhere. And when you look at the anti-Semitism, which is sort of interesting, when you look at the anti-Semitism in among Muslims and in the Muslim world, and in the Arab world, you find that it is Western anti-Semitism that has more or less been exported into that world. So one of the great sort of examples that people use about particularly Egyptian anti-Semitism was the prevalence for quite a while of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that you could find very commonly in Egyptian bookstores. People pointed to this fact and say, look at how the Muslims are so, especially, well, that's a Russian book. It is a Russian scam from the early 20th century from the Tsarist Russia, and it is obviously an anti-Semitic classic, as it were. But it is important now to ascribe to particularly to Palestinians in this context anti-Semitic motivations, because as Sahar just mentioned, when we ask the question why are these Islamophobic tropes so prevalent? Well, the answer is that why are they being used to prevent a debate on the merits? The reason is that the pro-Israel ideology doesn't work on the merits. It fails. It cannot make the case on the merits, because you can't make a legitimate case to hold people without rights for 75 years, to dispossess them in order to create your own state. These are things that the world has seen in many other places, including right here in North America, but we don't think it's okay anymore. We look back at it and said that was wrong, and we don't actually sanction it today. Today, people are looking at how do we address American history and the genocide on which it was built and the theft of the land on which it was built. People are asking those questions, and even people who don't like the answers to those questions have to acknowledge that that's what happened and it wasn't okay. So that would be the argument that pro-Israel forces are trying to defend. They can't. So without being able to win the discussion on the merits, you resort to ad hominem attacks, mudslinging, and in this case, building up an entire sort of ideology is not quite the right word, but an entire idea that the criticism of Israel that we see everywhere around us is based entirely on anti-Semitism. So when, excuse me, when the Hamas attack on October 7th happened, my response was to say, first of all, that it was horrible and it was illegal and it was, just an atrocious act that isn't okay. But also to push back against the idea that that was frequently being parroted, that this was the worst attack against Jews since the Holocaust. First of all, it isn't. Actually, there have been worse ones. As somebody pointed out, Argentina's junta in the early 70s was actually considerably worse, both in scope and scale. But that point aside, which is kind of meaningless, the important point is that nobody on that day was attacked because they were Jewish. No one was killed because they were Jewish. No one was wounded or assaulted because they were Jewish. They were victimized in that attack because of what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for 75 years. They were targeted as Israelis, not as Jews. And this is evidenced by the fact that many of the people who were killed, kidnapped, and assaulted on that day were not Jewish. Many people, there were a number of Bedouins, there were a number of foreign workers that we have documented, and part of those identifications were quite visible to the attackers at the time. This was not about attacking Jews, and it sounds like a fine distinction, but it's an important distinction, because though this act cannot be justified or excused, it can be understood in the context of many other incidents that we've seen historically where colonized people fight back. And very often when colonized people fight back, they go beyond what we consider, or certainly what international law considers acceptable. It happens because people have been stripped of their rights, dehumanized. And when you dehumanize people, sometimes this is the result. And it's not okay. That is not in any way justifying the act, but it is a way to understand it. And it was very important, I think, for Israel to convince people that that was not the case here, because by convincing people that that attack was against Jews and motivated not by grievance but by anti-Semitism, that justified, in many people's minds, this overwhelmingly, and I will not hesitate to call it genocidal, response by Israel. So that's why I find this concept and of a uniquely Muslim or Arab anti-Semitism to be so pernicious, because it's used by, interestingly enough, white nationalists very often to justify these sorts of crimes against oppressed people. It's sort of bizarre when you really look back on it. Everything is kind of backwards here, but it's also exactly what we're all fighting against, and what Jews, Muslims, and everybody who's fighting for a more just world are coming together to oppose.
Finally, Sahar, my last question to you revolves around the report concluding by saying that this rise in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian racism results in, quote, discrediting the Palestinian people from realizing their full civil, political, national, and human rights. So I wanted to know, what are your final thoughts about this topic that you hope our audience will remember after today's episode?
I think the most important takeaway for the audience is to listen to Palestinians, watch the videos they produce, read the work that they write, read the journalists, whether they're Palestinians in the diaspora in the West or in the Middle East or in other countries, or whether they're Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and also Palestinians that have Israeli citizenship, because it's their voices and their perspectives that have been muffled, that have been silenced, that have been criminalized in some cases. And what we're trying to do at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is to provide a platform for those perspectives, as well as perspectives of Muslims, of South Asians, of people who have historically been othered, historically been dehumanized. And that is effectively what makes the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which, as you said, published this report, radical, right? And in a very American way, and in a very progressive way, because the way in which certain communities, and they almost always end up being communities who are numerical minorities, and which translates into politically vulnerable and less powerful, is the way that you dehumanize them and you perpetuate their subordination, and you perpetuate kind of the systemic denial of equality and economic opportunity and dignity, is you exclude them from the public conversations. There's a reason why Rashida Tlaib was censored. The term she used was pretext. Our center has done research on this issue from the river to the sea, and we found tens of cases of Israeli officials using that term, from the river to the sea, in how they define the borders of Israel and what should be the borders of Israel, and to justify the ethnic cleansing at best or the genocide at worst of the West Bank and Gaza. So this term, as Mitchell said, is stated with different intentions depending on the speaker. And we have many examples of Israelis using that term for genocidal purposes, just as we have many examples of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans and their supporters using that term for purposes of wanting either a one-state solution where everyone is an equal citizen, or for a two-state solution, or to make sure that you have freedom for both Jews and Palestinians, and you have security for both Jews and Palestinians from the river to the sea, right? There's so many ways that one can play with words. But the point is that Rashida was attacked because she's the first Palestinian to be in Congress, and she's actually expressing her perspective. She's talking about her community in a way that centers their voices. So whenever, this is a message to the audience, I always tell my students the same thing. When you see somebody trying to cover something up, trying to hide it, trying to quash a perspective or a voice, ask yourself why. And then go read for yourself and you decide, you be the critical thinker, rather than this patronizing, infantilizing approach that Zionists have, which is, no, 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 let us be the gatekeepers. Let us be the people who determine what can be published, what centers can exist, who can give lectures, and who can write books. Because we have a particular agenda, a political agenda that we want to control, the people's perspectives. And as an expert or a scholar on authoritarianism, it looks quite similar to what we see in authoritarian states. So the type of behavior we see from these right-wing Zionists in the United States, whether they're in the form of a lobby group or politicians or so-called nonprofit groups, or even self-identified, anti-hate groups or anti-Semitic groups, the tactics they use are highly authoritarian. And we as Americans have got to fight back against that, because just as we're opposed to those types of behaviors by white nationalists or anti-Latino racists, or pick your group that is seeking to suppress the voices and ideas of another group, we have to be equal in our opposition to those types of authoritarian agendas. And so with that, I can't help but put that pitch in for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at csrr.rutgers.edu and on our YouTube channel, because we have over 80 lectures by various experts of various identities talking about various issues, but it's all centered around bringing the critical perspectives of communities and individuals who are the losers in the American or global system that privileges some groups and harms other groups. And so listen to those, as Derek Bell said, listen to the voices at the bottom of the well. Listen to the people who are losing from a system before you make your own conclusions as a critical thinker. And so I hope that, the readers, when they read our report and when they read about Palestinian perspectives, that they'll always think about what is the other point of view. Because right now, and this is a factual statement that I stand by because the facts are clear, right now, the mainstream view that any American hears in the media, in college, by politicians, in any area where the elites are involved, the mainstream narrative is the right-wing Zionist narrative. So you are not getting the full picture. And so you have to go and do your own research. And hopefully this report is one of those resources. And hopefully the work of Mitchell in his book, I'll put a shout out for Except for Palestine, and hopefully my book, The Racial Muslim, and Arsalan, your book as well. There are many books out there that provide those perspectives. And I think it's really, the burden is on the individual. And our job is to protect the individual's right to be able to read and to be able to watch what they want, and not allow these slanderous accusations of anti-Semitism without any factual support to quash the debate.
Sahar, Aziz, and Mitchell Plitnick, thank you so much for joining us today on the Unpacking Islamophobia podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
For more information, please visit bridge.georgetown.edu. See you next time.